Hello students, so I am going to go ahead and add some more color to my example of the elements booklet. Remember that if you are in person, you are working on a booklet that is 21 inches long, and we have already done the accordion fold so that it would open up, and then you would have all of your different elements drawn on the inside. If you are working as an overflow student or at home, you will probably be using paper that is 9 inches by 12 inches, and I have shown you on a video how to get your paper set up like this, and you'll be using that format. Either way works, and for either option, the coloring and the detail and the altering so that your shapes will reflect the different elements applies. So this particular video is definitely beneficial for both. So what I'm going to do is I'm working on my color example right now. I'm using colored pencils, and what I'm doing is a gradient of the cool colors on the actual positive shape, and then I'm doing the warm colors in the negative shape. So basically on her, I'm doing my cool colors, and then in the area around, I'm going to be doing the warm colors. That way I'm showing sort of a color relationship there. And I've already done some purple into some blue, so now I'm just working my way up on those cool colors, putting some lighter blue in here. Now a lot of you have probably already colored and or shaded with Prismacolor pencils before. One thing that is important is to make sure that as you are transitioning from one color to the next, you don't just completely go heavy into that next section. What you want to do is press down the hardest where you want that particular color to be the strongest. And then you'll press down less and less as you sort of transition into the area where the next color is going to overlap. So you can see that my blue gets lighter and lighter as it goes up, because what's going to happen is I'm going to be going into that next section with some blue-green. Because you remember on the color wheel, the colors transition primary to a tertiary to a secondary to a tertiary to a primary, so on and so forth. So I'm going to put a little bit more of this sort of periwinkly blue. It's kind of an almost very light blue-violet, but not very much violet in it. And I'm just going to use that sort of on this back end here. But then I am going to go ahead and start pressing down less as I move up where the blue-green and eventually green is going to be. And you'll notice that I'm keeping my pencil lines really close together so that it is a nice smooth color in that shape rather than a whole bunch of pencil lines that I don't want. So pressing down less as I move across. And another reason why it is important to transition your colors that way is because, quite frankly, your paper has a texture to it. And if you use up sort of all of the texture that is on that paper before you get to the next color, then you won't have any tooth or texture of the paper to hold the color that is coming next. So right now I'm just sharpening some blue-green a little bit. And then I'm going to start gently overlapping where I have the blue. So I'm not pressing down very hard yet, but I will eventually get to where I am pressing much harder.
Teachers, please excuse this interruption. This is a reminder that report cards are distributed this morning, first period. They are located in your boxes. If you have any report cards left over, if the student's not here, if you will bring them to my office and we'll mail them out this afternoon. Thank you.
So now you can see that I'm starting to press down a little bit harder with my blue-green as I overlap that blue a little bit so that it transitions smoothly into the next color. So anytime you have a color transition, just like when you have a value transition, you will be working in layers. It's not just going to all of a sudden be the color or the value that you want it to be. You're going to have to build it up in layers so that it stays nice and smooth, and you can be more intentional about your color placement or your value placement. So now you can see I'm going to go ahead and start pressing down less as I move up along her face here, because eventually that's going to fade into my green section. But this blue-green section is not necessarily even finished yet. I'm just going to go ahead and start getting that first layer in there. Turn my page. And now I'm just going back in and kind of filling in some of those gaps so that my color is nice and smooth, and so is the transition there. Anytime you have an edge, kind of like how she got her chin here, I definitely recommend turning the page so that you're using the actual tip of your pencil along that edge so that you can keep it nice and neatly defined. So now I'm going to work on this section a little bit, very much the same way, not pressing down super hard at the beginning, and then the more you build up that layer, the more you understand your color placement and where you want the colors to transition, the harder down you will press. Still keep those pencil lines really close together. And now I'm going to start pressing down less as I move across that space, because eventually I'm going to be using my green directly on top of that. So now I'm just going to go back in with another layer and just kind of smooth things up, going back in the opposite direction, and or using the sort of circular coloring and shading method will really help with that, because it will just kind of fill in some of those gaps. Just making sure that that transition here from the color into the white of the paper is nice and gradual and smooth. That's just going to make my transition into green smoother too. So now I'm going to go ahead and get my green. I'm going to use a lighter green at first, and then I'll transition that into a darker green. And once again, I'm not going to press down too hard at the beginning, and then as I overlap that color more where the colors are going to transition, I'll press down harder, so it fills in those spaces. Turning the page, pressing down, varying the pressure. So this does take some time, but it is well worth it. And I do actually have some non-color pencils. I know that sounds odd, but I do have some non-color pencils that will be arriving next week. And then these will actually help us make transitions smoother, because they're kind of like blending pencils, specifically for Prismacolor. I know there may be some in the classroom, but I have yet to look, so I went ahead and ordered some. So now I'm pressing down harder because those colors are overlapping more. And you can see that they are starting to blend, they are starting to fill that space, and it's starting to transition from one color into the next. Some colors transition more quickly, others take more layers. It really just is up to the pigment in the color, and sometimes it's even just up to the person. Because it sounds weird, but you will find that some colors are easier to work with, partly because you like them better. It sounds odd, but it is true. But the pigment has more to do with it, because softer pencils are going to be easier with transitioning and shading and blending, and a lot of times the warmer colors have softer pigment. So they will tend to be a bit softer and easier to blend with. Blue is another color that has a very soft pigment. Green and purple tend to have harder pigments, so you do have to work a little bit more at those values and those transitions. So now I'm just getting really nice and light here. And I could go back into that with white, or I could use a darker green. I have not yet decided, honestly, because I was originally going to do a darker green, but then the more I get that light green up there, the more I think it should just get lighter there, and I'll go back into that with some white. Because even though white is not a cool color, when it mixes with that green that I have there at the end, it'll make a really pale green, which is a cool color. So again, just pressing down more as I get into those areas where I want the colors to overlap, to fill those little white gaps and make that color transition nice and smooth. Remember, you can turn the page whichever direction you need to in order to make this work best. And one thing to note is that you will probably go back over with previous colors. So a lot of times when you are shading, like I would go back over some of this section with the blue to blend it out even more. So shading and color transitions are sort of what I consider a push-pull. So you work forward a little bit, then you work backwards a little bit. Forward, backwards. First color, second color, first color, second color, so on and so forth. Sometimes you may even use a third color. Or you may be working on a third color and have to go all the way back to the first color because of how far down it goes. So just be willing to go back to a color that you've already used. It will make your transition smoother. It will take a little extra time, but it will make the overall project much more successful. So I think I am going to go in there with some white. And you can see that the white and the green are sort of blending together here and making just a very pale green. And then just like with the color, I'm going to press down less and less as I move across that space. And remember, the media that you use for this project is up to you. You do have some options. You do not have to only use one medium either. So like if you want to use colored pencil on some, watercolor on others, acrylic on some, marker on some, a combination, it's completely up to you. I kind of want to use this project to help see kind of what your skill level is with the different media that you choose. Because remember, as I am grading this project, I am looking mostly to make sure that each element is obvious. I'm not so much grading technique or the way that the overall result is, as much as I am looking for each and every single element to be quite obvious. So that might be sort of my cool colors that I'm going to be using on her face. And then again, I will use warm colors in the background or the negative space in very much the same way. But I don't necessarily want you guys to feel like you have to watch that whole thing. So what I'm going to do now is use a different medium. I'm going to use Sharpie on the shape one, because what that's going to do is make those shapes really nice and bold. So you could definitely use Sharpie, you could use colored pencil again, you could use regular markers, you could use paint, you could even cut little bits out of a magazine and glue them down because they would be flat and they would be shapes. And here, honestly, I probably should have started with the negative space, because typically you do want to work from the furthest back section up towards the front. But since I'm not doing any blending or overlapping here, it should be okay. And I think I'm just going to do each shape a different color to really emphasize the shape concept there. So like I said, if I do each shape a different color, it will help to emphasize the fact that it is shape and that they are flat, because shape is our element that does use color, but no shading and no depth. So I'm not going to sit here and make you watch me necessarily color every single part of this, but I just want you to know that multiple media is definitely going to be your friend on this project, because it will make it more interesting for you. Plus, it's a really good chance to experiment with something that you might not be 100% sure exactly how to use. Because, like I said, this one is graded primarily for whether or not the elements are quite visible. If the elements are quite visible, but your technique is not 100% perfect, that's totally fine for this one. So I'm just going to continue coloring these. I'm just going to use a random assortment of colors to emphasize the shapes. You could definitely still use a color scheme, even though shape is not color itself. Having a color scheme at any point in time is never a bad idea. You could absolutely use black as well. So like if I wanted to keep her silhouette black or keep the background black, I absolutely could. You could use white also. White would still be considered a color. Or you could do the whole thing completely in color. You could do her with Sharpie, the background with watercolor, combination of things. So it's completely fine. So on your next little video, because I don't want any one video to be too crazy long, your next video I'm going to show you how to do watercolor for the value going from dark to light in the back, and then I'll use graphite on her or the other way around depending on which colors I end up picking there. But I will continue working on this example using a couple different media, and I'll post images as I go along and probably some more video. That way you guys can watch things, you can follow along, you can get ideas, so on and so forth.